All right, everyone, here we go with the rest of the notes for Chapter 6. We're going to cover Section 6 in this video, and we are getting into the nitty-gritty of it. We are talking about the various elements of a voice acting performance. Here we go. First off, let's talk about the idea of less is more. Accuracy with pronunciation or an obvious presentation does not necessarily create the highest level of believability. Keep in mind that when we are doing vocal performances, we are trying our best to make things sound real and believable. So, in a way, we're talking about certain principles and tactics that we can use in our vocal delivery performance, but sometimes in the words of a candy bar commercial of several years ago, sometimes you just gotta break the rules. And we'll talk about some of the ways that that might be appropriate as we go along. So the thing is, when we're talking in terms of how we give a vocal delivery performance, it's not always that we need to be crisp and articulate in everything that we say. And sometimes that even detracts from what we're trying to do. What we want to do is that we want to make things sound as believable and realistic as we possibly can, so that the audience member that is listening can kind of believe what's going on and can connect with the story and follow what's happening and get the experience from the piece that is originally envisioned. So the thing of it is that as we talk about less is more, sometimes we need to try to not try so hard, is kind of what we're saying. One of the aspects of that is giving what's called a half-voice delivery. A half-voice delivery is reducing the volume or loudness of your voice to roughly half of your normal delivery. What this does, it creates a greater intimacy with the listener, which can draw them into the story being told. So you don't always have to be on at full blast when you're doing a performance. Sometimes it takes stepping back a little bit and creating that sense of just that one-on-one, that intimacy sort of thing that audio can really be a strong suit for. Did you catch yourself drawing yourself in a little bit as I brought the volume down a little bit just then? That's a half-voice delivery. Now, just as less is more is a tactic, sometimes more is more can also be used as a strategy. When we talk about giving an over-the-top delivery, what we're trying to do is, again, create a believable illusion of reality. And in this case, what we're trying to do is present an attitude or an emotion that feels slightly exaggerated. And this can create a stronger, more visual sense of reality depending on the situation. So this is something that you can use as a tool if someone needs to sound kind of eccentric or irritated or is really excited about something. Or they sound overwhelmed at what is happening around them. They don't know what to do. However, you want to be careful that you don't take it too far over the top, or you stand the chance of breaking the illusion of reality with a delivery that sounds forced. This is one of those things that does take a little trial and error. And sometimes, if you're trying to create a character that is just way beyond anything that's normal, to kind of take it to the extreme when you're doing an over-the-top delivery might be effective. But by and large, what we're trying to do is create a sort of persona in the over-the-top delivery that we get the emotion. We're trying to emphasize the emotion. We're trying to maybe exploit the emotion that's going on a little bit for the purposes of the script. Maybe we're trying to get some sort of a humorous point across, or we're trying to just drive home a point in which the eccentricity is really going to help us there. So you can use that tool, but unless the character really calls for it, you don't want to go super extreme in using the over-the-top delivery. All right, we'll talk about performance dynamics now. First off, talking about pacing. Pacing is the variations of speed in your delivery. In most cases, a steady pace without phrasing is boring and uninteresting, if not downright hard to listen to. And that's true whether that pace is consistently slow or medium or fast. So if you're constantly talking at the same pace, whether it is at any of those speeds, you're going to lose people. So it's much better to break things up in such a way and to speed certain things up and slow certain things down in order to help keep the audience engaged. And those are things that you're going to learn to develop in different ways depending on what it is that you're saying and how you want that message delivered. So you can kind of hear how pacing is going to help you to emphasize certain points or to emphasize certain emotions and reactions. It all depends on what you're trying to say and what the intended connotation of what you're trying to say, how you deliver that and how that comes across. Volume or dynamic range, the variations in the loudness of your delivery. So the dynamic range of a performance is directly related to attitude and to tone, from soft and intimate to loud and aggressive. So right there, hopefully you hear the differences in what is called for and what that sounds like to the listener. Volume can be a very good tactic to help you to be able to convey those sorts of things. One thing you do want to watch with volume, especially if you are recording yourself, is to make sure that you're watching your VU meter readings, because softness can introduce getting too low in the VU meter range, and you introduce room noise and that sort of thing. So you may have to play around with that a little bit. Same thing with the loudness. You don't want to overmodulate and then wind up having your recording clipped and distorted. So be mindful of that. If you're working with a producer, the producer should be monitoring those things for you. You can do some different things to mitigate those issues, such as talking off mic a little bit when you get louder, or getting closer to the mic when you're softer, so that you still get the essence of the change in volume with what you're trying to do, but your overall recording is not going to suffer as dynamically because of the becoming much louder or becoming much softer. And of course, you can also, when you're doing your own recordings, watch the VU meter readings. In addition to stepping away from or getting closer to the mic, you can also adjust the volume on the fader on the console board on the mixer to help you with those things. Vocal range or vocal variety, putting variety into the performance by adjusting the pitch and the placement of the voice to maintain interest and to portray a person's expression. So sometimes speaking in a lower pitch can allow for a certain expression or emotion, and so can speaking at a higher pitch. Those are a little exaggerated, but you get the idea that we tend to be a little more serious when we're talking in a lower pitch. And if we're happy, our voice kind of goes up a little bit, and you hear the excitement and the joy that comes from someone that's speaking higher. A higher voice can also be something that's a little more anxious, or a little, someone's unsure of themselves. Someone that speaks lower sounds more confident, authoritarian, very matter of fact. vocal range. The key to understanding performance dynamics is in the interpretation of a script. What is the objective? What is it that you're trying to do? What is the ultimate message that you want to convey, and how do you want that message to be received? What is your audience expecting? How will they receive certain messages in certain ways? If you use a certain volume or pitch, is it possible that the audience could get confused or maybe even offended by the way that you deliver something? And if that's the case, the meaning behind what it is that you're trying to say is going to get lost. So you want to keep those things in mind as well. What about the emotional and dramatic effect of the way that you use your voice to be able to say certain words in certain sentences? Will that emotion be conveyed? Think of a character maybe like a Ben Stein, who tends to have a very monotone delivery. And if you've ever watched any of his commercials or some of the shows that he's been on, and it's part of his shtick, it's what he does. But the only way you know that he is excited about something is if he says, "Wow." And that's supposed to be his genuine excitement level. Generally, unless, again, that's what your character calls for, if you don't add the emotion in whatever way it's best called for, then that emotion is not going to be conveyed over to the listening audience. And then also considering intellect and comprehension. Are we using words that are too big? Are we insulting the audience's intelligence? Are the words that we're using appropriate for the character that we are portraying? If we're using 50-cent words for someone that has a nickel education, it's going to sound out of place. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Also, the way that we say certain words or use certain words in combination with certain emotions may not be appropriate as well. So all those things need to be kept in consideration when it comes to performance dynamics. All right, articulation. It's the clarity with which words are spoken, so that the words that come out of our mouth are words that can be understood for the words that they are. And this is the idea of making sure that we get every sound that is appropriate for the words that we are speaking, especially when it comes to audio performances, because the audience does not have the luxury of reading lips. It does not have the luxury of words on a screen to be able to follow along with. It is just what they're hearing with their ears. So it's important to at least be articulate enough that it not only fits the character and fits the mood and the attitude of the script that we're reading, but also for clarity purposes for the audience. Now, if we don't do that, then of course certain words are going to get lost. One of the things that may cause that is something called lazy mouth. It's the tendency to not fully use the muscles of the tongue, the jaw, or the mouth when speaking. All of us tend to do this on some level because in normal everyday conversation, we're not trying to make sure that the words that come out of our mouth are totally appropriate and have all of the phonetics of all the different sounds that we make. One of the most popular ways would be if we were talking, on the screen here, if I were to say to use the muscles of the tongue, jaw, or mouth when speaking, as opposed to saying speaking. That's something that we do need to keep in mind when we are doing vocal performances, that as much as is possible without overkilling and making things sound unnatural, that we're getting as much of the sound of the word out as possible. Some common articulation errors to watch for. You can see the details on these in your textbook. things like sliding S's. And this can really be a problem, especially when you have a word that ends in S immediately followed by a word that begins with S. So to try to keep those sounds distinct can be a challenge. There's also dropping D's. Mostly at the end of sentences, can happen at the beginning as well. Swallow G's, like I did in the example on the last slide, where you lose the G from ing. And also making the S sound and the Z sound similar. That's a common error as well. It's very easy to confuse the two when you're speaking, but you notice that the S and the Z, they kind of start off the same, but there's a very distinct sort of sound that they make overall. So it's important to try to make sure that you make those distinctions when you speak. Plosives are caused by excessive air rushing out of the mouth whenever speaking letters such as P and B and G and K and T. So when I said those letters, I did as best as I possibly could to not P and B into the microphone, because you do get those sounds. It creates a loud pop when you record them if you're not careful, because it's that sudden rush of air that is coming out. It hits the microphone. And even if you're talking in everyday conversation, people that overemphasize those sounds, you can kind of hear that popping. So the way to correct for plosives would be to either turn slightly off your axis of the microphone, or you can use tools like a foam windscreen on your mic, or place a pop filter in front of the microphone. These will help to prevent the popping sound from going through and hitting the diaphragm of the microphone itself, and create a much more pleasant overall sound for those that are listening. To achieve a conversational and believable delivery, it is often necessary to violate some of the basic rules of crisp articulation. And we talked a little bit about that already. It's the idea of trying to make things sound natural and believable. But you don't want to get too lazy here. Again, we only have the voice to communicate our message. And if you slur certain words, or you don't fully pronounce them the way that they need to be pronounced, it is possible for listeners to either miss a word completely or misinterpret the word that is being said. So it's important to understand and master the correct way to do something before you can effectively do the thing incorrectly and make it believable. In other words, you have to be good at what you do before you can do something badly, and do it intentionally, and do it in such a way that even though you are messing up words, that you do it in such a way that people understand you're saying messin' when you mean messing, that sort of thing. However, when you're speaking in a conversational style, you also want to be careful to not over-articulate, because that can be annoying for people to listen to. I worked for several years in Christian media, where there were radio stations that did a lot of teaching and talk sort of programs. So a lot of sermons were being broadcast over the air. And there was one particular preacher by the name of Dr. D. James Kennedy, that if you ever went back and listened to some of his recordings, he was one that used over-articulation quite a bit. For him, I believe it was something where he used that as a tool to try to get a message across to people, for them to have to pay attention to every word that he was saying. I found it, though, as rather annoying, because you spent too much time listening to the fact that he was over-articulating as opposed to the actual message that he was trying to say. And in that sort of case, number one, you lost the message. Number two, it made him sound like he was kind of pompous, presumptuous. This is my opinion. There are other people that in the Christian world love this guy. But it's the risk that you take when you do over-articulate. So you need to find that happy medium to make sure that you are saying words clearly enough that you're able to carry on the conversation, to create that intimacy between you and the listener, and that they actually kind of catch the message that you're trying to convey without going over the top with articulation or missing sounds that people miss the message in your casual delivery. It is common in everyday conversation to drop the ends of words, and we instinctively fill in the missing sounds, the missing sounds, I should say, as we listen. But in voiceover, those ends of words are important, and they need to be heard to at least some degree. So again, you don't want to over-articulate here, but for example, if I were to say need to be heard, I'm dropping those D's. So you don't want to overemphasize need to be heard, but you do want to emphasize that you need to be heard. So you get the D sound in there. You don't put it over the top, but you also don't just let it drop off either. Okay, so those are a lot of the things that we need to keep in mind with articulation. Closely related to it, diction. Diction is the accent, inflection, intonation, and speaking style dependent on the choice of words. And diction is going to be appropriate based on the type of character that you are portraying. You can think of different regional accents playing a role in the way that we do diction. If you're playing somebody that comes from, we'll put it this way. I have family. My mother grew up in down east North Carolina in areas around Duplin County. And as a young person, we would go and visit that family. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has its own weirdness in terms of accents and things like that. But even to this day, when I would go and visit family down in that area, they have kind of a certain spin on the southern accent in such a way that certain words get slurred. Some people speak at a much faster pace, and you don't necessarily catch all the words that they're saying because there's a combination of the fast pace of how they speak and the slurring of certain words and not pronouncing all of the parts of a word. That in combination with the accent makes it very difficult for someone to understand what they're saying if they're not from that particular area or not used to that way of speaking. But at the same time, if you're portraying somebody that is from that area, you can take some of that and maybe try to not slur the words as much, but still get the intonation of the accent. Pick up the pace of your speaking in such a way that it can be a representation of somebody that lives in that area if you're trying to portray a character in that way. So diction does become important in trying to make you sound like you are a believable character from a particular area or from a particular culture, or of a particular background. But you want to keep enough of the rules of speech in place so that you can be understood. Tempo and rhythm. Tempo is the speed at which words are spoken. Rhythm is an aspect of phrasing that gives a voiceover performance a sense of musicality. So what we're talking about here is that There are certain times where you want to say things quickly because you only have a limited amount of time and you're trying to rush through something for one reason or another, either because you're creating a sense of urgency and excitement about it, or you're just trying to get something done within a certain amount of time. Sometimes you take it nice and slow so that people can follow along, or maybe because you want to portray that you're kind of thinking about what you're saying as you say it. Rhythm can be used in that way as well. We're talking about the flow of words. Sometimes you kind of mix up that tempo aspect where you're saying something slow, which is the main point, and then you're talking about other points a little quicker because they're not as important, but they kind of augment what you were saying before. The ways that words are organized in sentences helps with rhythm as well. So you may put certain words together in such a way that they will sound more natural if you speak them quicker, and you put other words together in such a way that it may make more sense, to say those things slower. And the placement of importance is also a factor here as well. So the things that we say in a sentence, the value of what we say in the beginning versus in the end relative to the type of message that we're trying to portray is going to help and affect the rhythm of what we say as well. Timing is everything. Timing is the combination of tempo and rhythm. It also refers to how this impacts interaction between characters. So the combination of tempo and rhythm and timing all work differently for different media. If we're talking about radio, we tend to hear things in a more fast sort of tempo. It gives the copywriter and also the talent the opportunity to quickly establish and develop an interesting story. So if you're trying to introduce something, for example, you may use a faster tempo in order to create excitement and urgency. You might use a slower tempo to make sure people are catching up with you and understanding the gravity of a situation, or that it's something that you really, really want people to understand and catch what it is that you're saying because the information is so heavy or so vital. So timing can also take into account use of pause. You stop and pause prior to saying something because we tend to pick up as listeners when something goes silent, when we're expecting to hear something. It catches our attention so that when we hear the next thing, we're waiting for it. We're there. And that's an effective communication tool as well. Phrasing, the overall flow of your delivery, talking about the variations of tempo and rhythm and timing. So we never want to use these three elements in a rather consistent sort of way. We want to mix things up. Those of you that do follow or do a lot of things with music, especially if you know how to read music. The notes and the notations and the different symbols that are on sheet music are there to guide you to be able to talk, to sing with different speeds and pitches, that you hold a note for a certain length of time, whether it's a short note or a longer note, and those sorts of things. Phrasing as a concept is basically the talking equivalent of how we would look at music to guide us in terms of using tempo and rhythm and timing. So this involves the way that you can say certain words or sentences and which words are given more importance. The way that you phrase certain things should be relative to what are the most important parts of the sentence, what are supporting parts of a sentence, what emotions are being attributed to certain aspects of a sentence, all those sorts of things. And tempo, rhythm, timing all that going into the way that we phrase certain things, how we go from thought to thought and sentence to sentence. All of that is going to help create that sense of what it is exactly we're trying to say and how we want the audience to receive that message, with what sort of tone and what sort of attitude and what sort of significance. Sustaining. One technique that we're going to talk about is pulling words. Pulling words is a way to focus on sustaining or stretching specific sounds, words, or phrases. This can be done with an entire sentence or with just a phrase or a few words of a phrase, and it can make for a more compelling delivery. This also takes up time to do, because when you're pulling words, obviously it takes longer to say something. Generally, the word say doesn't take that long. But if you're saying something as opposed to saying something, well, it's going to create an emphasis on that word that you are pulling. But again, it takes a little more time to say. Sometimes you have that luxury, sometimes you don't. What about the little words the and a? These words are pronounced different ways depending on where they fit in a sentence and what sort of meaning that we're trying to give. Now, the specific rules on how to use the versus when you use the, and how you use a versus using a, the rules are kind of complex and they would be a little hard to go over in terms of slides and a lecture and this sort of thing. I would encourage you to read the section in the textbook on this. But it is important to kind of understand how these things work, because when used correctly, the words can help add power and emotion to your delivery, but if they're not used properly, you come off sounding awkward and uneducated, like you really don't know what you're talking about or what it is that you're trying to say. So you want to keep that in mind, and if you're not sure when to use which pronunciation, look it up, check it out, or even just try voicing both ways and listen to which one sounds better. Attitude, the mindset of the character. We tend to know what attitude is. We talk about people having attitude, and usually that's seen as a negative connotation, but people also have positive attitudes, and that's shown through emotion and through the intent of what someone is trying to say. Sometimes the underlying meaning of what someone is saying or motives behind when people say something, that's going to show attitude as well. So it gives reason for the words, and it gives motivation for the character's existence and behavior. Sense memory. People have sensory experiences, and we're talking about those 5 senses that are associated with their emotional experiences. And to fully realize your creative voice acting abilities, you want to develop skills for recalling and utilizing sensory memories. One way to be able to do that is if you're talking about how something feels. Say you're talking about how silk feels, and you can think about your experiences in which you've touched silk and how that makes your fingers feel, how you receive the way that that object feels. And for some, they like the smoothness of silk and it gives them a positive feeling. That's something that you can use to help you to portray something in which you're positively experiencing feeling something soft. If you're talking about being out in the woods and there's that smoky sort of smell that comes from when you're at a campfire, that's another example of trying to create that sense of what it's like to be walking in the woods, being outdoors, maybe also the scent of trees, pine trees in particular, those sorts of things. So we can use what we recall about things that we've experienced through our senses to help us to be able to deliver appropriate lines when we read copy. Subtext, the thoughts and feelings behind words. We're talking about the inner motivation. Again, these are kind of the things that are not said, or that they're said maybe in terms of an innuendo, that we're alluding to something else that we're not necessarily talking about. And you can use sense memory to unlock emotional hooks to help you to set attitude in these sorts of ways. One good example is, a lot of high school conversations when you're talking about if you're interested in a boy or a girl or something like that. Invariably, someone's going to ask, so do you like him, or do you like him? And that's supposed to be a way of saying, so do you want to ask the boy out, or do you want to date him? Do you want to be his girlfriend? That sort of thing. So the way that we say things without necessarily using the actual words, that's what we're talking about with subtext. Tone, the sum total of all the things that we've talked about. So each of those different elements together comes over into the tone of what you're saying. And if you change your tone as you read, you wind up falling out of character, and your audio levels will fluctuate. Your character becomes less believable. It becomes confusing to the listener what it is that you're doing as you're doing your read. So you want to be very careful about when you make decisions about how you're going to say something relative to what you're saying in the rest of the script, relative to the rest of the copy, if there's other characters and other things that are going on. Make those choices, commit to them, do them consistently, and make sure that the decisions you make are appropriate to the overall vision for what is happening in that piece. And maintain your part of that overall vision by maintaining consistency in how a character would sound in certain situations, how they would say things in certain situations. One thing that you could do is think about how you personally would react in certain situations, and then try to relate that to you giving voice to your particular script, whether you're portraying someone that's different from you, or if you're doing just more of an informational read. Don't change things up too drastically that it becomes hard to follow who you are and who you're representing and what you're saying relative to the rest of the piece. Pause for importance. Pause is an aspect of phrasing and timing that implies that something big is coming. We've already talked about that a little bit. This can be used to create humor, drama, tension, suspense, or emotion. You do want to watch. Improper use of a pause can result in an uneven or choppy delivery, or a delivery that sounds as if the script is being read. What I kind of did there, those of you that might be fans of William Shatner, he's known for being made fun of for having awkward pausing in the way that he says certain lines. And generally, that's not going to work for delivering an effective message. So you want to use pause in a way that is going to help you to convey a message, as opposed to using pause awkwardly because you don't know what it is that you're saying or whatever. Make sure people can follow your thought, and use pause in such a way that you're going to emphasize what's coming up next, or because you're showing that you're thinking about something that you're about to say. That's an effective use of pause as well. And the way to effectively use pause and make those decisions is to understand your copy. Read through it beforehand, make those decisions beforehand, and deliver those pauses in your copy, in your read, intentionally. Thought pacing using ellipse. This is one way for us to think about ways of using pause. Ellipse either indicates someone being interrupted or a pause in delivery. It can also be someone interrupting himself or herself. And you see on the screen some different types of interruption. The speaker being interrupted by a thought in his or her own mind. You know, you start thinking about, well, okay, so you're thinking about saying something one way and you decide to change course or you change your mind or something like that. So you kind of stop yourself from saying what you were about to say and perhaps either just shut up altogether or change course in the way that you were going to speak. Or the speaker is interrupted by somebody else. So someone's saying something and then someone else just kind of butts in and takes over. Or the speaker resumes speaking after having been interrupted. So you might see ellipse used in all three of those ways. Points of ellipse provide opportunity to reveal thoughts in your character. Pacing your thoughts using pause in this particular way. You can also, in addition to just silent pause, perhaps use a verbal pause, something like a or something like that. Generally, we talk about using in such a way that it's not a positive thing for us to talk in terms of using in a professional manner, because it shows that we're not intelligent enough to be able to portray what it is that we're saying, that we're thinking about what we're going to say before we're going to say it. Sometimes, though, in copy, when we're doing things as a vocal performance, it's very appropriate to do that because we do it in real life all the time. This can also be portrayed, this thought pacing aspect, by ad-libbing, saying things like or oh, or you know, because those are words that we use as well to be able to give us a half a second to a second to think about what we're going to say or how we want to say something, or we're reacting to something prior to saying what it is that we're going to say. So these things help us to be able to convey those ideas that either an interruption is taking place or that we're processing what it is that's going on around us and then taking that extra time to be able to respond to whatever is happening. Imitation. Mimicking others can be a great way to learn pacing and inflection and nuances of particular voiceover niches. However, this should only be done with the intention of finding your own unique voice and style. So, if I were to take a poll on who we think are very effective voice actors and who sound great and people that we would love to emulate, I have a short list myself. But if I was to just do everything that a Mike Rowe or a Morgan Freeman does, then I would be no different than Mike Rowe or Morgan Freeman. I would have a much different sound to my voice than what I do right now. I would deliver lines in very different ways than what I do right now. But the way that I do things, that is my signature voice. That is what I bring to the table. And I create something that no one else can duplicate in the same way that I do it. Because if I was to be another Mike Rowe or Morgan Freeman, well, why wouldn't they just hire Mike Rowe or Morgan Freeman? You get what I'm saying? So it's good to imitate, so you might pick up certain skills and practices, but then you need to be able to fold those into putting your own kind of spin on them and being able to make it uniquely you, so that that becomes a thing that you bring to the table, not just Mike Rowe 2.0, for example. When you're doing a vocal delivery, should you stand or should you sit? Generally, standing is the preferred performing stance for nearly all short form copy. Things like commercials, promos, trailers, character voice work. And the reason for that is that standing will give you better breath support, it gives you more flexibility of movement, and it allows for a wider range of motion without being restricted. We've talked about how body language can help us to be able to give a vocal delivery even though people don't see what it is that we're doing. Using gestures and moving around helps us to be able to get into the right attitude, the right tone for what it is that we're saying. It also gives us better breath control so that you can make better use of your lungs and your diaphragm. So in most cases, standing is preferred. Now, if you're doing something more long form, if you're doing maybe a reading of a book on tape or like a long form narration of something, then, being on your feet for that long is going to be challenging. So it would be okay to sit. But when you do sit, you want to remember to try to keep a straight back. It's going to help your breathing and your delivery. Now, there may be times where your character is sitting when you're reading a script. So that would be a time to sit as well, because your delivery is going to become more believable if you yourself are sitting. So you're going to talk as if your character is sitting because you are sitting. So that's something else to consider as well. Generally, standing is going to give you the most flexibility and power to be able to deliver a vocal performance, but there are times where sitting is going to help you as well. Finally, be in the moment. Creating a believable representation of a given moment in time is a fundamental pretext of all acting, not just voice acting, but acting in general. So being in the moment requires an understanding of the story, your character's role in the story, and a great many other factors that will ultimately allow your audience to momentarily suspend their disbelief, which is what we're trying to do when we're conveying an audio message. We're trying to get that theater of the mind rolling in the members of the audience so that they can visualize what is going on as we are telling the story. They can create the picture and be able to follow along with us. And they themselves are in the moment if we are in the moment of living out the character that we are reading as we read the script. So there you go. There's the notes for Chapter 6. Make sure you finish up the study questions and turn those in along with your notes. Make sure you check out the pre-class questionnaire on Blackboard. Attend the virtual class so we can talk about the things that were discussed in this particular chapter and give a little back and forth, learn from each other in that process. And as always, continue to monitor your Cougar Mail and Blackboard for the latest and greatest and any changes that come around in the class. We'll see you around.